QSO Today episode 410, Dave Mackey K1KA. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo is coming September 17th and 18th, 2022. If you have a ham radio story, technology, breakthrough, or project that you'd like to share at the expo, please sign up by going to this week's show notes page and clicking on the image. We also have some amazing enhancements to our Kumo Space lounges this time around and are anxious to share them with you. Stay tuned. There are a number of ways to support the QSO Today podcast and projects, including just clicking on the sponsors menu item and using our affiliate links to get products and services listed. These vendors give us a little spiff for our sending you to their business to make this a win-win solution for all of us. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Dave Mackey K1KA, like many amateurs of his generation, was influenced by broadcast radio, broadcast hosts like Jean Shephard, and the magic of radio in the late 50s and 60s. Dave went on to work with companies like Multitone, Microwave Associates, and Cushcraft before spending a generation in his own manufacturing company. Amateur radio played a serious role in Dave's career choices and personal successes. K1KA tells his story in this QSO Today. K1KA, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Dave?
4Z1UG from K1KA. Hi, Eric. Good to talk to you.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, I can remember when I was probably 5 years old, and I was given the privilege of turning on the AM radio in the morning when we listened to the morning show. Now, to me, that was really exciting because I was just amazed that voices would come through the air. It seemed like magic to me. Frankly, it still does, but it really was magic to me. And the fact that I had the honor of learning how to turn on the radio, adjust the volume, that was a big deal. And I was always asking questions about it, so I was probably a bit precocious from the point of view and maybe a bit of pain in the neck. But I guess that a couple of years later, for Christmas, my brother received a transistor radio kit. Now, this is probably 1952 or 53, and transistors were, like, really new. And I remember he and my brother, I was just a little kid, so I didn't really get to, I had to stay out of the way. They were working, they were busy working on this thing. They got it all together, and it didn't work. And they finally scratched their heads and figured out that maybe they had to replace the transistors. Now, these were CK722 transistors, which was like the first transistor that you could really get in general distribution. They got another set of transistors. They tried again, still didn't work. And in retrospect, I think it was probably my father's big old soldering iron, which was nowhere near what they have today for dealing with transistors.
Wasn't it used for soldering the radiator on your car?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's what my father had as well.
That was his idea of soldering, and he had no idea that you couldn't use it. Somewhere in my junk box, I ended up with one of those CK722s, and I still have it.
Did you have a junk box when you were 7 years old? Were you already acquiring technology?
I guess the next thing that really happened was that my family got a TV set. My grandfather had an old Philco radio, and he figured, well, he didn't need it anymore, so I was the heir to the Philco radio, probably because of all my questions about radio and voices going through the air. I can remember turning around and hearing these guys talking, because it also covered, I don't know, maybe up to 2 or 3 megahertz. I don't remember exactly how high it went, but I could hear some gentlemen talking back and forth. And my father explained to me what that was. It was ham radio operators. They were grown-up men. So to me, that was all something that grown-up men do. But I'd listen to broadcast band stations and got into broadcast band DXing and all of that. And I was just generally reading things like popular electronics. I was never into really building things early on. I was into how it worked and why it worked, and trying to figure that part of it out. Later on, my brother into junior high school, 7th grade, I think it was, and the shop program started at that grade, and he got into electric shop. Well, I heard all about everything that went on in electric shop, and one day he brought home a crystal set that he had made. Well, my brother is a person that if he likes something, you're going to be indoctrinated. So I was making my own crystal set, and we had 2 radio stations. One was maybe 2 miles away, running 5,000 watts. So you can imagine that took up most of the band. And the other one was WOR, New York City clear channel radio station that ran 50,000 watts. And that one carried Jean Shephard. I know you've heard about Jean Shephard before through Bill Mara and all his discussions about that. He was sort of this guy that the kids listened to. And he told all sorts of stories about how he was a ham radio operator when he was fairly young. So suddenly the idea that you could get a ham radio license without being some old guy started to take hold. And a year or so later, my brother ran into some guys in the school who were already licensed. In fact, they both had general licenses. And they got him to get his license. So he was, I think this was 1956, he became WN2FDL. And in similar fashion, of course he had it, I had to get one too. So next year, I became WN2TND. I had already learned the code in Cub Scouts, I think. And so that wasn't much of a problem. And, the math and some of the questions on the novice test were a little taxing, but, I understood enough of it that I got through the test.
What grade were you in, Dave?
I was 12 years old.
So your first license was at age 12?
Age 12. And I was the youngest ham radio operator in the city at the time.
Wow. And what was the hometown?
Hometown was Elizabeth, New Jersey. My house was just about 11 miles southwest of the Statue of Liberty. So that lets you know kind of where we were. It was just at the edge of what I would call almost a continuous city at that point, which went further east. From, I guess, our part of Elizabeth west, the neighboring towns, we were more in the suburban area. So it was just sort of the start of it.
So you were surrounded by radio stations and potentially ham radio operators in those days?
A lot of them, yes, a lot of them.
Okay, so you're 12 years old and you have a novice station. Your brother has his novice. Did you guys build a station together, or did he build a station first?
Well, he started to build one, I think it was in QST, and it was, you put together this wood frame, and you got a couple of tubes, and you mount them on there, and he went through all that, but could never get it to work. So this friend of his, one of the original guys, in fact, the guy who gave me my novice test, who was a general, he lent him a transmitter, and it had an 807 in the final, and it would go on 40 and 80. And the way you changed bands was that you put a different crystal in, then you got out the soldering iron, and it had to tap the RF coil, main RF coil in the output, not to get a tuned input at all. So it was pretty rudimentary. I don't know what the signal sounded like, but that was the way we got on the air. And it was mostly me getting on the air. He was fairly not very busy, or he was very busy with other things, I should say.
Were you using the Philco radio as the receiver?
No, that original box that I was so excited about turning on and listening to the AM stations was an S38. And it was a radio my father bought in 1946 when they very first introduced. He had it mounted in a cabinet, and it drove an amplifier and a big 12-inch speaker. And that whole electronic arrangement was made by my uncle, who was really an engineer for RCA. So he had all the stuff to do that. Once the TV was there, the S38 wasn't used very much. So when we got our ham licenses, my father said, "Here, use this." And it was far better than a Philco. But an S38 isn't a particularly good receiver either. But it was at least something to get on the air. Now, at night, it was almost impossible because Radio Moscow was pretty much dominated the 40-meter novice band. And in the afternoon, I could get on and work some people.
Did you try like 15 meters?
Well,
Novices had 80, 40, and 15?
yes, but I only had 80 and 40 on this particular transmitter. It would not go on 15. Later on, my brother decided that he needed to build a better transmitter, and he built a DX40, DX40. And that was really the transmitter that he used. Since I was still this little kid, in his opinion, I was not really allowed to use it very much, only when he was there. And we didn't have crystals for 15 meters, so I don't think it ever got used on 15 meters. And he, before his license ran out, he was starting to get interested in other things, and particularly airplanes and flying. He was, 15 years old or 16 years old, coming on 16 years old. And so the DX40 got sold because he wanted to save up money for a car. So there I was, and the 807 transmitter was returned to its owner. So there I was with really not very much. But one day he belonged to civil defense, which was a bunch of guys, mostly in high school, who would get together once a week and they'd have these meetings about how they go out and provide emergency communication. Well, civil defense owned 4 or 5 Gonset communicators, 2-meter AM radios, and you could periodically bring one home. So he brought one home, and there I was, a novice, actually able to talk. I didn't have to use CW, and that made a big impression on me. I started to, there were so many hams in the area, there were a lot of people on 2-meter AM at the time. And every time he'd borrow it, I probably used it far more than he did, and I got really interested. Well, eventually that stopped, and my license was about to expire. I was able to upgrade to the technician license, but I didn't have a radio to use. And that went on for another year, and I was maybe old enough lawns, etc., and I bought my own Gonset communicator.
Also on 2 meters?
On 2 meters.
It sounds to me like with your brother in junior high school that there were some other kids that, were into ham radio. But were you part of a ham radio club in the area? Did you seek other hams besides your brother to find as a resource for ham radio?
Yes, very much so. I became, because I was talking to people who were in the area, even on CW, and certainly on 2-meter AM. I got very much involved with the local radio club. I would go to field day with them. He was kind of almost out of the hobby. He got into flying. And in fact, he's now ended up being a 747 airline pilot for many years. So that was the start of it back then.
What was the radio club that you joined that was around you when you were a kid?
Union County Amateur Radio Club. That was the county we were in. I don't think it exists anymore, but there were a lot of kids, because in those days, a lot of kids were becoming hams. It wasn't the problem we have today. And there was quite a smattering of older people. It was a good ratio because there was always somebody who could teach you something, or you could ask a question or you needed to know something. Plus the kids, sort of had their own little chit-chat going on themselves. So it was quite a good combination.
Did you have any mentors that you remember?
I remember there was a guy who he actually owned a grocery store. And behind the grocery store, he had a huge wall of every radio you could imagine. And he had a tower out the back. And he'd spend most days on the radio. And he was on all these nets. And he was the one who was sort of convinced me that, I should really get on HF. Because I'd really been on 2-meter AM for a long time. The thing about 2-meter AM that really excited me was that every once in a while the band would open and get tropospheric conversion, and you could work hundreds of miles with my little 6-watt Gonset communicator. And I think that was the aspect that really interested me in those days, was not so much how the technology worked, but how the radio waves propagated.
On the Gonset communicator, as I recall, there was like a SO239 connector in the middle of the top of it, right, that had the antenna. Was that what you were using, or did you actually have an outside antenna when you were using the Gonset?
I had an outside antenna. Initially I used the little 19-inch whip that it came with, and I could still work people with that because there were a lot of hams in the area. But I eventually put up a a beam, and then I actually designed a beam and built that and put that up. I used to read the W6 SAI EHF handbook when I was a kid and just devoured it. And he talked all about EHF propagation, all the different modes that they were in. And that was fascinating. And so with that bigger antenna, I was able to work those several hundred miles away. Before that, I could listen to local people, big guns more or less in the area, and they'd talk to people I could never even hear.
For civil defense, I think the Gonset communicator was really designed for kind of a high-density civil defense, right? You would have these units in every neighborhood or on every block or something like that. So having the antenna on the top of the radio would be good enough for civil defense. Is that kind of the right idea?
That was the right idea. I think it was that this was a completely self-contained unit that had a built-in power supply. You plugged it into the wall, and you plugged in either that 19-inch whip or whatever other antenna you could get, and you'd be on the air.
Right, so if telephone lines were down or something like this, that you'd have this local communication.
Right. I remember one of the classic things that we do every year with the Civil Defense Group was we'd provide lost child support during the annual fireworks, which was really a huge, thousands of people with it. And we were set up all around this park that was held in, and different places, and if we had signs out there bringing, if you're lost, come here or whatever, and we would have a net that was on, and we all had these little 19-inch whips, and because it was, maybe 2 miles at most, we were doing just fine.
So this store owner, do you remember his name or his call sign?
Yeah, it was W1JZB.
And the station was actually in the store itself, so he would kind of mind his store while talking on the radio?
Yes. In fact, sometimes he would be annoyed because a customer would come in. It was not, let's say, in a downtown location at all. It was sort of off to the side in the neighborhood. It was more or less a point of convenience than...
Yeah, we have those here where I live, in the neighborhood, if you have to buy milk or eggs or something like that.
You could go there anytime, and we would help for that. And then in the club, I remember there was just any number of people who you could ask the question of. And you got to know who was the expert on this and that and the other. So that was very helpful in those.
And now this message from ICOM America. Heard it, worked it, logged it. This summer, keep your competitive contesting edge with ICOM. Our high-powered base stations cut through pile-ups, letting you work the bands and log those contacts. Contest from the comfort of your home or remotely with the RSBA1 app. The ICOM IC7851 gives you a new window into the RF world, and its on-air excellence is unparalleled. With faster processors, high input gain, high display resolution, and a cleaner signal, it's truly the pinnacle of HF perfection. Features include dual receivers, digital IF filters, memory keyer, digital voice recorder, high-resolution Spectrum waterfall display, enhanced PC connectivity, and an SD memory card slot. The ICOM IC7610 is the SDR every ham wants. This high-performance SDR can pick out faint signals in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The ICOM IC7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio that has changed the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. Its features include RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receiver, and dual digicell. Create your own band openings with the ICOM IC9700. This transceiver brings direct sampling to the UHF-VHF weak signal world. This all-mode transceiver is loaded with innovative features that are sure to keep you busy that include faster processors, higher input gain, higher display resolution, and a cleaner signal. This has become the new de facto standard as a baseband rig for microwave operation as well. Features include 4.3-inch touchscreen color TFT LCD, real-time high-speed spectrum scope and waterfall display, smooth satellite operation with 99 satellite channels, dual watch operation, and full duplex operation in satellite mode. The ICOM IC7300 is a high-performance, innovative HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed expectations. This innovative HF transceiver digitizes RF before various receiver stages, reducing inherent noise in different IF stages. The IC7300 changed the way entry-level HF is designed. It is the go-to rig in my station now, and I love it. Features include RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, and an SD memory card slot. Just know that you'll be very pleased with one of these fine rigs to enhance your contest, DX, and general ham radio operation in your station. Be sure to check out these ICOM rigs and their full line of base stations and portable radios at an amateur radio dealer near you. And when you make that purchase of a fine ICOM rig, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO Today. So, did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Yes, but it didn't work out exactly how I planned. I was in school. I was very good in physics. I liked physics courses and science courses, but somehow I just couldn't get the math down. And I got it down enough to get through okay, but it wasn't my strong suit. So when I went away to college, I had this idea that I was going to be a radio astronomer. And I took physics courses, and I did extremely well in physics, and I sort of skated by in math. And I realized that looking at the course material that was coming up, that the math part of it was going to be extremely more difficult. So I said, I've really got to look into something else because it's not going to work out for me if I can't do the math or understand. So I looked at a few things and I ended up studying economics. The math isn't too bad. It's sort of a bit scientific. And I graduated with a degree in economics. And I went on for an MBA degree in marketing. And that's kind of what I did. However, almost every company I worked for, except for my own company at one point, was a technology.
That's fascinating. Where'd you go to school?
I went to a place called Uppsala College in East Orange, New Jersey. It's not there anymore. For graduate work, I went to Rutgers University.
And that's where you got your MBA?
Yes.
When you say you work for technology companies, did you seek out technology companies to work in because you had this interest in technology, but also you're now a marketing expert?
I think I did. I mean, during college, mostly during graduate school, I actually had summer jobs. And I had a summer job for ABC Network one year. It was actually a union position, but they needed people to fill in for, they call them summer relief. And I worked in there was a technical department that was involved with soldering and setting up studios and this sort of thing. And I also learned about big videotape machines and how to maintain them and the technology behind them. So even though I wasn't an expert in engineering, I was an expert in the practical aspects of it in terms of maintaining some of this equipment. ABC Network used to run I think it was called Wide World of Sports, where they would cover golf tournaments or other events. And they'd have these big trucks with portable cameras and setups, and they'd go out to some golf course and set up every weekend pretty much for whatever the event was. On Monday morning, these would all roll back into Teaneck, New Jersey, at least the ones that were in the eastern part of the U.S., and that stuff needed to be maintained. And I was one of the crews there that would work on that stuff and fix it. So I was involved in technology from the point of view of the practical limits of it, but I never had an engineering degree per se. But I certainly had a good understanding of RF propagation.
So my grandfather used to watch golf on TV. I always thought that was probably watching flowers grow out of the ground was probably more interesting than watching golf on television. I apologize to the listeners who like watching golf on television. But tell me something. Did they have cameras in those days at every hole, or were they like kind of leapfrogging in order to be able to have cameras at every hole? Did that mean that they had to pre-wire that whole golf course before the tournament in order to be able to have that kind of coverage?
Well, they didn't cover every hole. but they covered, let's say, the important hours, and they'd know which ones they were because that was all planned out ahead of time. And yes, there was at least one camera on these holes they were covering, probably multiple cameras. And it was long before the days of portable cameras. So these things would be set up. There would be tons of cabling that would be out there. There was sometimes a whole one of these vans that was out there, the big trucks. It was filled with nothing but the cables. So it was a big deal to set one of these events up.
These cameras were not on the grass. They had to put platforms out, right, in order to put these camera tripods on the grass.
There were usually elevated platforms or in some other location where they had a stable position. It certainly went on the grass.
Yeah, I would think that the whole logistics behind covering a sporting event, especially in those days, I mean, now people, I guess you can cover it with a cell phone camera and have better pictures than you had 40 years ago, 50 years ago. But those were huge, huge operations in order to be able to put cameras out on the green.
Well, I'll tell you a funny story. In those days, instant replay didn't exist, except one of our engineers decided that maybe you could do it. And he developed this system, which he had actually Ampex custom build for them, which was a big, probably an 18-inch wide hard drive disk. It wasn't enclosed in anything. It had a feeder that could feed on it back and forth to record and play back. And they actually built like 3 of them. And they would ship those out and they would replay, whether it was a football game or a golf tournament. They'd replay it until the first machine broke down, and then the second machine would be online, and then the third one would be on. And they never went through a whole weekend where everything was working, so that all 3 of them would come back in. And there was one guy, and that was his job. He'd work all week getting these things ready to go out for the next event.
After you graduated and got your master's degree in marketing, that whole New York to Princeton to Philadelphia area, there were a lot of high-tech companies there, including RCA, I think, was there. Western Electric or the Bell Laboratories was there. Were those the kind of feeders to the companies that you worked in later on?
Well, I actually ended up working for fairly small companies. I worked for a company which was only about 5 miles from where I lived, and they were actually an English company, and they made radio paging systems. So radio was the appealing thing to me. It was all, their major market was hospitals, and it was generally 30 megahertz channels. There was a business band, and there were paging channels in that band, and that's what they were using. And they were being sold, we were actually the U.S. division of an English company.
What was the company's name?
It was Multitone Electronics. Our major competitor was Motorola, but we had a high percentage of the hospital market. There was other customers too, but a lot of them hospitals.
Right, I remember Multitone Electronics and their pagers. I think they were tone only, right? They would go beep boop, but I think they also then later had voice pagers.
Some of them had voice, and eventually, I mean, the first ones they had were basically regen receivers, if you believe that. It was very simple technology, but it was done well so that you didn't have the typical regen problems, and they actually worked pretty well. And they were still ultra cheap. They sold them for, a pretty good profit. And eventually, the market, the wide area paging market, started to become very significant. This is really just before cell phones started.
This was the mid to late 80s.
Yeah, I would say in the early 70s, mid to early 70s.
I guess wide area paging started in the 70s.
Yes, they really started there, and it became digital. A lot of it became digitized. And that's really, the problem is that, it wasn't two-way. And once they decided, or they came out with a cellular phone system, that was kind of the end of that type of paging. Cell phones sort of took over.
Did you stay in that business all the way through the end of it?
No, I actually moved. That's when I moved to New Hampshire. A company recruited me who actually made a software version of the tone encoders that they had. And also eventually they made a digital version. And they were in New Hampshire. So I came up here to run their efforts. But very quickly, I was recruited by Microwave Associates to in a position in the broadcast service, since I had some experience in broadcast, only from a technical point of view, but I understood the technology, and I was in charge of the broadcast technology that they used, which was either transmitting signals from the studio to the transmitter, which was all on microwave. The cameras, then the electronic news gathering was just starting at that point. And so we had a 10 gigahertz camera links that we'd set up, as well as 2 gigahertz from, say, a truck to a remote station. And that became a market where overnight all the stations had to have this technology. So we were quite busy.
I think I remember those days. Well, that's very exciting. You said you had your own business. What business did you have?
Well, when I got married, we had a daughter, and my wife really didn't want to work. So we tried to figure out how to make that work. She wanted to stay home and take care of her daughter and then do the daycare bit. So I had these dust covers made for one of my radios with somebody in California. I don't know who it was, but I ordered them for some radios. Some fit, some didn't. My wife, who was into sewing, said, I could make that. I said, I wonder if we could make ham radio dust covers. So I put a little ad in QST, and we started to make ham radio dust covers. 20 some odd years later, we were into the computer accessories business, the full line of accessories, into international distribution into all the superstores. This was most of what I did in my career, and it was totally non-technical. Just had to do with marketing and sales.
The dust cover business became this large company 20 years later?
Yes. It started in ham radio. They came out with VCRs. I'm sure you remember VCRs. Well, you could do really expensive dust covers with VCRs because they all had little clocks on them. So we had to put a window in for them because these were made of material that looked like leather. And we would get distribution. I mean, at one point you could buy our ham radio covers at all the stores. We had displays, we had retail packaging. And then computers came out, TRS-80s and all those out, which was just a gigantic market. And it overshadowed everything else. Eventually, we really even stopped making the ham radio dust covers. And it was and then we'd add other products for the computer business. We had mouse mats, we had carrying cases, we had all sorts of things that we made or bought in and labeled, private labeled, and had through all the stationary superstores and catalogs.
What was the name of your company?
It was called Amherst International at that point. It started out being called Covercraft. That was the original name. But when we sort of expanded it, it was called Amherst International. And Amherst was the name of the town where we lived at the time.
And was that your primary vocation, or were you also working for other companies while you were building up this one?
Well, originally, yes. Ham radio thing first started, but I mean, I was working for Microwave Associates when we were working on this one, but at a point where we just couldn't. I mean, we were both working at a job all day long, and then we'd have to spend till like 6 hours at night still working on this other job, this part-time thing. So we said, enough was enough. And I finally had to give up my job at Microwave Associates, which was a steady paycheck for this, I hope it works idea. And it did. At one point we had 100 employees, so this became a fairly major thing. But all things come to an end. It became more difficult. It was a large part of it was labor intensive, and it became more difficult to compete with offshore competitors. And finally we said, we're just, this is not a marketing thing anymore or a technology thing anymore. It's an accounting thing. And so we sold that business. And I was just going to retire and become a consultant. That's when I went with Cushcraft. My friend, who I'd known for a long time, was then president of Cushcraft, and he needed some help expanding his new product line into the international markets. And so I helped him with that. And he said, gee, you should do this full time. So I said, okay. I did that for 3 or 4 years.
When did you finally retire? How old were you?
Well, that company, Cushcraft, was eventually sold to MFJ. And so, that project sort of came to an end. And I was going to become a consultant again. And I found, or they found me, I guess, a French company who made surveillance radar technology. And I can't even remember how I got together with them, but the fact was that I was used to exporting things, and now they wanted me to import. And since I was familiar with the ways of Europe and had done so much traveling over there in my previous years, that I was kind of recruited to take on the U.S. Market. But it was pretty much the Western Hemisphere. It was a small company. It was kind of only a few years out of startup. But they had made some big progress with the technology there. They were using, and I guess the analogy would be software-defined radio. This was software-defined radar.
What was the name of the company?
Well, the name of it was called Software Law. Now, it's a French company, and it was software is everything in France is society for. That's the way you refer to a company. It's not a company, it's a society. And the word society is at the beginning rather than at the end. So software log essentially meant, and log refers to software. So log, it was society for software, was what the name of the company really meant. And they had some pretty darn good technology, and they had just landed contracts with the Port of London and some other very high-profile customers as this little company, but they had technology which was far less expensive than what was traditionally available and much better.
That's very exciting.
After 9/11, the coastal surveillance portion of the business became extremely popular, extremely in demand worldwide.
And are you still involved with that?
Now, I was there for 13 years and finally retired back in 2013, I guess. No, I was there 15 years. So.
It sounds like you've had a nice ride.
Yeah, did a lot of different things. But then it was another technology company, and the people who held my job in other places, they were all fully vetted engineers. There I was just this marketing guy. I happened to know about radio and radio propagation and how technologies work.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA30N, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. And what were you doing in amateur radio during that period of time?
Well, that was very interesting because I discovered that being 250 miles closer to Europe made a big difference. I had been on HF doing some DXing when I was still in New Jersey, but when at Microwave Associates, there was a whole group of hams. I mean, there were so many hams in my building. There was probably 12 or 15 hams just in my building. And, we got they were involved in microwave construction and all sorts of things. So it was a very interesting time. There was some fairly big, well-known DXers. Fred Collins, W1FC, was the chief engineer. And Dane Atchley, who is now passed, is W1CF. He was an avid 80-meter DXer. And he and Fred developed the very first model of the Foursquare antenna used on 80 meters, and eventually 160 meters. But they did some of the very first development work on that antenna. So that And in fact, that group of guys years earlier were involved in the very first EME, 2-meter EME, not 2 meters, but the first amateur EME contact, moon-bounce contact that was ever made back in 1960. And it was that same group of guys. Fred was a lot younger guy then, but a lot of the guys at Microwave were still there who were involved in that project. There was a fellow, Sam Harris, who was the chief engineer at the time. He was W1BU, I think. Excuse me. He kind of led the charge on putting together a transmitter and a receiving system good enough, and it was on 1296 megahertz was the frequency they used. And they talked to, I think it was W6HB in California, and it took them several times before they were able to do it. And that was sort of the beginning of amateur radio moonbound. Well, all these guys were there at Microwave Associates, so it was kind of an exciting time to be part of a bunch of guys that were quite knowledgeable.
Do you know anything about the four-square antenna?
Oh, I do, yes.
So my question about the four-square antenna, because as you mentioned it, does the way it work require phasing and switching? So did like pin diode switches and things like that, were those necessary in order to make at least change the direction of a four-square antenna? Was that the innovation that came from the guys at Microwave Associates?
Well, it was the idea that you had to phase the antennas, obviously. And I don't remember the details of the technology that Fred and Dana used, but it was something that was unique at the time.
To be able to not only phase it, but to change its direction.
Well, by phasing the antennas, you in fact change the direction. It became like it's in effect almost a vertical 3-element beam, and in any of the directions that you select. Well, you have 4 directions, and obviously there's some nulls, but it's not that direction. The main thing it did, though, was that its vertical plane was much better than the dipole, which people were using for the most part. And Dana would remember on certain winter days, he had to be out the door because propagation was going to be just right to work Japan. That was his thing. He wanted to work Japan, and he used to do that.
But the value that they brought to Microwave Associates outweighed any lack of presence on the campus, right, when there was DX to be worked? Well,
Microwave Associates had a number of groups, and the group I was in was actually the only group that actually made radios. The others were involved in various types of components. The traffic, the police used radar detectors, not radar detectors, but police radar speed
guns.
Speed guns, yes. And at the heart of that was microwave components. And so we were very busy making those. In fact, one of them, at the heart of that, Dana said, this is something we can use on ham radio because they operate at 10 gigahertz. So we came out with a device called a gunplex.
Right, I remember.
And Microwave Associates made it and sold it, but they made zero profit on it. Because Dana said, we're just going to make this available. We just want this to be something that we can get people to use some of these microwave frequencies. In fact, the group that I was with, Fred was kind of primarily an 80-meter HF guy. But I used to talk to him about VHF because I was very much involved still in VHF and VHF contesting. And he said, we could put together a winning VHF team because they're not using the microwave bands. If you look at the typical scores that were being turned in, most of the contacts were maybe up to 1296, but probably more than just 70 cm 432 megahertz. That was most of it. So, and at the time, the scoring was done, the multipliers were ARRL sections. And in New England, we had like 6 sections. And you could, with very little technology from a high hill, you could work 6 sections. Now, you certainly can't do that in Texas or California or the middle of Arizona because each of those were its own section, while California is divided, but not nearly as much as all of New England. So we decided we were going to make a point, besides making this gunplexer available. And we put together a group of a bunch of VHF contesters as well as HF contesters, because I belong to the local HF contest club too. And we went out and we just established really record-breaking scores. We sent teams out to each section and then worked them on each of the bands, because the guys had all this technology they'd been building for years. So it was very successful.
How did that affect the way that you operate personally?
Well, I became very interested in I was already interested in VHF, and I was really kind of involved in the formation of this thing and trying to figure out better ways of doing it. One of the problems that was thrown up immediately is people said, "Well, you're just sending out guys there. You're cheating." I said, "No, nothing against this in the rules. We're using, we're not using Microwave Associates equipment. We're using our own equipment, and we've gone out doing this." And at the time, the ARRL was trying to figure out what to do about VHF contesting, because all the top scores were pretty much between New England and Washington, D.C. If you were west of that, you were sort of off in another world because of the way the multipliers were. In Europe, they were using a grid system, and pretty much everywhere around the world. And the idea was that you were working specific size grids. Everyone knows grids today, but that was just not used here in the U.S. at the time. If you used a grid system, you'd be able to be, let's say, more fair in the way you're doing the scoring. So after a couple of these contests, they formed what was called an ad hoc VHF committee, and I was the guy who was on it. And it was clear that the movement was going to be to replace the multipliers from sections to grids, because that's what was accepted all around the world. There was quite a bit of concern that this was not going to be accepted readily by U.S. people, and how we were going to actually get from point A to point B with this. And my old marketing brain kicked in, and I said, well, you're going to have to phase it in, and you're going to have an award program. So the idea was that I think the very first contest we had was a sprint contest, and it was 2 or 3 hours on each band on successive nights on different weeks, and the multipliers were going to be grids. So, for example, Monday night was, say, the 2-meter night, and you'd run for 2 hours and you'd work all the people you could in that 2 hours, and the score would be developed by grids. And actually that worked into the fact that there were already activity nights almost every night of the week in different bands. That had been established long before. And the idea of a sprint contest was something that was done on HF. So by putting the two together, this was sort of a natural thing. And then they eventually, I think the next big VHF contest, they still were on section multipliers. But the one after that, they went to grid multipliers.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. So the grid system that we use now, where you give your grid square where you're living, was that in place in those days, or is that something like relatively new?
It was in place. It came. He says, "Well, where do we get grids?" And he said, "We imported them from England or from Europe." The system we use is, I think it's, you look back, it's called the Maidenhead system.
Right.
And that's where, in Europe, even going back before then, there were actually several different types of grid systems that were being used, but they're all grid systems of some sort. And there was a big conference in this place in England called Maidenhead, where they lashed out exactly how they were going to do it. And so Europe had figured out, and they were all using the Maidenhead system. So for us here, all we had to say is, okay, we're going to adopt that system. because the world was already divided into grids. We just had to figure out which one we were in. And that became fairly easy to do with various little computer programs that you can get at the time.
How old is the Maidenhead grid system? Is it World War II? Is it newer than that?
I think it's later than that. I don't know specifically, but I want to say it was probably something that came out in the 1960s.
And the grid numbers, they look like they're hex, right? Or something like that, and so therefore they're made from computation?
Well, grids are, I think, 1 degree by 2 degrees. And you can take the Earth up and divide them up that way, divide it up that way. And then the system just uses up to really a 4-digit code with the 1 by 2 grids. Those grids can be subdivided, in which case you add 2 more digits to figure out where you are in your subdivision. But most people today just use the 4-digit grid.
How long did it take for the United States and the ARRL to kind of settle down or settle into using this grid system instead of sections?
It happened amazingly fast. The spring contest was well received. The next, I think it was not the June contest that followed it. Spring was in April. The big June VHF contest followed it. That was still in regular section multipliers. I think there was a UHF contest after that, sometime in August, that might have used grids. But the main September VHF contest was in grids, and we never looked back. Sections were kind of done.
Why do you think there was resistance to going to a grid system to begin with? I mean, I'm kind of asking more of a general question in terms of, are we as a group resistant to change, and so therefore anything that's introduced as new is something that's always to be fought against?
I think, yes, everybody's a little resistant to change, but in fact, the system, it was really kind of obvious, and they were more afraid, let's say the league was more afraid that it was not going to be accepted than actually what happened. The reason they sort of eased into it more, I think, was more a fear of a negative response than what actually happened. So they were justified in doing it.
Now, over this period of time, did you become a DXer, contester? And is that what you do now?
Yes. I'm still fascinated by propagation and how these signals come out of that black box. It's all sort of magic.
So by working DX, it kind of reconfirms every time the magic of radio to you.
Yes, and exactly the mechanism for why it happens. I know we sort of think we understand it, but there are some bands that I don't think we really understand at all, like 6 meters, these skip openings, what I call these skip openings. I'm not exactly sure that that's really the mechanism. And I sometimes wonder whether some of these reflective F-layer reflections and other reflections that we count on every day is the whole story. It's probably a large part of it. But sometimes signals come through so pure, and they must have bounced off the Earth in the ionosphere so many times in order to get to you. It's hard to believe that they really impacted the Earth in the ionosphere that much and still come through that pure. Other times, it's like on 6 meters, it's extremely local. You can have a reflection from a station in Europe, for example, and now we're going through a period where we have European stations coming through on 6 meters, and I'll copy them just fine, and somebody a few miles away doesn't hear him at all, and he's thousands of miles from me. And wait a few minutes, and it's a completely different story. He's gone here, and my friends are coming through their phone. So exactly what the mechanism is for this and why it opens this way one day and it's totally different, it doesn't open at all the next day, is something that I haven't really seen a good explanation of the technology or the propagation theory that explains it.
What's your favorite operating mode?
The short answer is whatever one I can work the DX on. I spend a lot of time on digital these days because I like observing And even in HF, you get some strange things that happen, some strange paths that open up briefly that then disappear again, which I don't think you'd see on any of the other modes because they're too fleeting. I know there are times when I can detect, I'm trying to work Europe, and suddenly there's a JA coming through, and I'm aiming nowhere near any path that you could define as going to Japan. These are some of the things that I think you see on digital modes that you don't see in other modes. And yeah, I know there's a lot of people that talk down about digital modes. I find it enlightening and fascinating and a bit challenging at times just to figure out what's going on and what you need to do to work the DX station. And I probably enjoy CW, even though I'm not particularly good at it, but I enjoy cracking pileups too and working the DX there if I can. I've gotten fairly good at that. But single sideband, I guess I can do that, but it's not nearly as much fun.
What do you think of the idea that the digital modes saved the radio companies during Cycle 24?
Well, I think it certainly saved a lot of... I'll tell you, I worked more DX during the bottom of Cycle 24 on digital than I could have imagined. And sort of set myself a goal of, I want to work so many new countries on this band. And invariably, I would exceed it. You'd just be amazed how much good propagation there still is, even at the bottom of a sunspot cycle. And digital modes, I think, had a lot to do with it. It kept people in the hobby interested who knows, they may have just faded away at some point.
I think what fascinates me about, like, say, Whisper, for example, is you can put up a wire antenna and you can actually see whether that antenna is even effective. It's always surprising, at least with Whisper, how effective that antenna really is.
Yes. I've tried Whisper and keep turning the power down as far as I can. I'm still amazed how far it gets.
Do you listen for any digital modes now? Because I understand that you have the long receive antenna on the ground. What do we call that?
Oh, beverage antenna, yes.
Do you listen to any of the digital modes using the beverage antenna that you have out in the back?
I do, yes. I use that on 160 and 80. I use what works fine on CW, too. I don't do very much single sideband on either of those bands, but CW and digital, yes.
The beverage antenna tends to be directional, and I guess it's one of the reasons that it's such a great antenna, and because it's also close to the ground and very low noise, considering the low frequency that it's operating on. Are you finding when you run digital modes on it that it actually, the antenna might be more omnidirectional than you thought?
Yes and no. The no part is, yes, it's still directional. However, because it reduces noise so much, you can hear in directions that it's not pointed better than you can on, say, a vertical antenna. So to some degree, you could say it was more omnidirectional, but it's simply because it's reducing the noise so much over the direct versus a vertical.
Right. And because a whisper or a other digital signal requires hardly any signal, then it actually just hears better.
My current project is I'm putting up two more. I'm replacing the one beverage I have with a bidirectional beverage, and I'm putting another beverage up 90 degrees away, so I'll have hopefully 4 different directions I can switch the beverage to.
Now, you have a beautiful piece of property. Before we started, I was looking at it from the aerial view. In order to get the antenna feed lines out into your back 40, did you actually do some real trenching, and do you have conduits that are running out beyond the grass out into the forest there so that it doesn't impact the beautiful landscape that's the backyard?
Yes. I have a short conduit that goes from the side of the house in the direction of the neighbor's house to the woods, and then it kind of runs above ground all the way back to the tower. And then it has a lot of control cables and as well as coaxial cables. Then I have another one that just goes straight back. That's a later one that I added, which is just buried. It's just trenched. And they did a good job because they laid the grass right back on there and really tell the difference 2 days later.
But it's large enough if you want to pull additional cables or replace cables, you can actually do that from each end?
I can, but it's probably I put extra cables in them, let's put it that way. That's the way I've dealt with that. The main coaxes are all big hard line.
The main coaxes are hardline, do you say?
Yes, right. 1 3/4 and 1's, I think, 7/8. Between my transmitter and my antenna is almost 300 feet, so I got to do something about that.
Now, I read someplace that you're doing meteor scatter.
Yes, I've done quite a bit of meteor scatter, although I guess I've worked about all I can on meteor scatter because it's kind of a fixed range. But I started doing that back when I was in high school. Built an amplifier. No, I wasn't in high school. I was in college at that point. When I was working at ABC Network, we built a kilowatt amplifier on my lunch hours and was able to work some DX on meteor scatter. In those days, what you had to do, because it was high-speed CW, you had to record CW on a tape machine, and then you get the output of the tape machine to actually operate a relay, and then you'd speed the tape up really fast. So it was, sending 50, 60 words a minute. And you have to have your ears really tuned good to pick the reflection. I mean, digital, that's kind of what Joe Taylor started, because he was doing that sort of thing, and he said, there's got to be a better way. And I'm the guy who can figure it out, and that's what he did. That's kind of where all the WSJT stuff started.
Is the meteor scatter community pretty large? I mean, are there people, if somebody wants to get into meteor scatter today, is there a large enough number of people that are doing it that they're actually, you can make some contacts?
Yes. There's people on every day, I think just about every day doing it. It used to be that it was only during meteor showers, but the digital modes, the digital technology that from WSJT uses randomness. You can get enough signal in a very short period of time to send messages, and there's always random meteors. There are a number of boards, real-time boards that you can sign into, where people are on there and say, "Okay, I'm gonna call on such and such a frequency right now. Listen for me," and people will be listening, and they'll come back and say, "Yeah, I'm hearing you," and then they'll have a contact.
And are there specific bands that are ideal for meteor scatter?
Well, as you go up in frequency, it becomes more difficult. Probably 10 meters may be the ideal band from a reflection point of view, although having a high-gain antenna on 10 meters is not nearly as easy as it is on 6 and 2 meters. 2 meters seems to be a really popular band for it because you can get a relatively small high-gain antenna and still have pretty good reflection. The bursts become shorter as you go higher in frequency. 6 meters works too. You can do it on 6 meters. But 2 meters seems to be the more popular. Well, I shouldn't say that. I've done a lot of 6 meters scatter. But 2 meters is good too.
And how do you know which way to point your antenna besides up?
Well, you don't really point up. You're really pointing toward the horizon. You're not elevating for the meter because it's the same idea that you're reflecting off a path that's near the horizon. The idea that would give you the most range. But if you're involved with a meteor shower where you kind of know the direction of the meteors, people will say, okay, this shower you should aim like in this direction. But if you have an antenna that's, let's say, not really sharp, you can probably do pretty well because you'll have enough signal and it'll cover a broad enough area that the arriving signal won't fall into a null. So I'm running a 5-element beam on 6 meters, and it works fine for meteor scatter.
And of course, you run some power. You run, a kilowatt.
Yes, I run power. I probably run about 700 or 800 watts on meteor scatter. And these days, with digital, you can make contacts with 40, 50 watts. People shouldn't be intimidated that they have to have a kilowatt to run meteor scatter.
They could run their 100-watt radio.
100-watt radio and a relatively simple antenna, and you can make contact.
But you might warn them they probably don't want to operate that radio at the top of its duty cycle, right? It's a digital mode. It'll be keyed down for a long time.
It's a digital mode, really, and that's one of the reasons why I don't run the full output of my amplifier because I'll have to give it a break eventually. So.
Do you do aircraft scatter? Do you bounce signals off of other kinds of flying devices?
I have not done that. It's interesting to me. That's one of the things I sort of like to do, but can't quite get to that.
What's the current rig?
I'm running a K3S and a KPA 1500 amp, and I have an old IC706, which I've had for years, and that's kind of my backup. And I have a Flex 5000, which I have yet to get on the air. Someone gave it to me, and I'm still trying to get to it.
Now, I see that from your QRZ page that you have a number of family members that are hams. How did that happen other than your brother? Your older brother was a ham, or is a ham. Did he come back to it?
Well, yes. I like to say he was my Elmer and I was his Elmer. He was, off flying airplanes and still with his technician license. And one day I said, you really should get a general. And he said, no, I don't have time. So I goaded him quite a bit. And, he went out and he passed the general finally. So he was living in Florida. He became W4LDP. And he decided, I'm really kind of interested in it now. He put up a repeater and got, typical, fully involved in it for a short period of time. And then that kind of quieted down. Years later, I got him on digital, and he got really interested in that, bought an IC7300, and he's got a couple of dipoles up in his place where he lives. And, but, that's sort of faded again, too. You notice my father-in-law's ham, too. That's an interesting story. So on the first date, I went to pick up this girl, eventually my wife, and I walk in, and there's this guy, and he's got a ham set up. Well, he and I probably talked for a half hour about ham radio. She's standing there, tapping my foot, looking at the watch, saying, are we going to go out or not? So eventually, she did get her hams, but that was because of a long commute I was on, and there were no cell phones in those days, and she wanted to know what time I was going to be home for dinner. So I call her on 2 meters and tell her. But my father-in-law had been licensed earlier. He wanted to get his son. His son was in high school at the time. This is going back before I met my wife. And he was somewhat interested in ham radio, so the father said, well, we're going to both get our licenses. So they both got their licenses, and his wife got his license. My mother-in-law got her license. So they were all licensed when I became on the scene. And later on, we had a repeater in New Jersey. A friend of mine had a small group of guys, and we put a repeater on Telegraph Hill in New Jersey, which, if you're familiar with the area, but there's a big tower right off the Garden State Parkway, behind the Garden State Art Center, which is a big performance center, and it's on about an 800-foot hill. And somehow we got permission to put a repeater up there, and we could cover pretty much all of northern New Jersey, and I could actually key the repeater from Connecticut. But my father was, because my father-in-law was on ham, got to know him. My father, I eventually got him to get his license. So even though he was sort of helping me out early on when I was first starting out, let us use the S38, eventually we got him on the air too. So everybody was licensed.
Dave, what do you think the greatest challenge that we're facing in amateur radio now, from your perspective?
New hams coming in. I think there's certainly a threat to our band. I think one of the challenges we have to figure out how to be more relevant. And that's been a challenge for, I think, the whole history of ham radio, certainly the early days. It's what Hiram Percy Maxim, I think, almost single-handedly fought a lot of battles back then because the Navy wanted to sort of do away with these kids that were putting these stations on. And he had to figure out a way to have ham radio become relevant. And he set up a sort of a national traffic system where you could send messages from one area of the country to another, even though each station could only maybe get 25 miles. He had a network all set up, and that was really the basis for the ARRL. And if it wasn't for some of the stuff he did, I don't think the hobby would exist anyway.
So do you think that in order for us to be more relevant, maybe we have to kind of bang the drum outside of our community? I mean, it seems like we're kind of an insular community in that we kind of talk to each other, but we don't seem to talk to anybody outside.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem. I think that I mentioned to you at one point, I listened to your interview with Des, and we were talking about rebranding amateur radio. And the thing that popped into my head was grassroots radio. And it wasn't so much a rebranding of amateur radio, because I like the term amateur radio myself, but I'm an old guy, I would. But it's more of a subtitle, say a description of it. We're trying to get more people into the hobby, but it's sort of a top-down approach. The league is trying to get people in to do what's already being done. And, the clubs are okay, but it's a bunch of old guys who did something which was their magic. My magic was one thing, somebody else's magic. The reason why they got into it was maybe something else. But we all end up with something which is maybe not relevant to, say, younger people, or not necessarily even younger people, just other people, other groups. But there are so many, I think you used the term, a big umbrella for ham radio. And it certainly is a big umbrella. There's so many little aspects of it. And if you look at those and you try to figure out what was the magic or the appeal of the people who are doing those things, and maybe we can reach out to those groups, define those groups, and have people who are successful becoming hams from those groups, like kids that we have successfully brought in from high school and become successful hams. They're the best evangelists to go out and get other kids. When I became a ham, it's because I was working all these guys who were my age on 2 meters or hearing about it. It was peers. Whenever you buy something that a peer tells you is, I think, worth far more than all the ads you see on TV about. Well, in this case, if somebody is giving you a speech from a high in a magazine, it's not necessarily relevant to you. So we have to figure out where some of these people are and what their interests are. And, like there's campers, people who go camping, people who go hiking. These are natural people for summits on the air and parks on the air. And there's, people who fly balloons. Well, a lot of that's being done on ham radio these days. So these little groups that I think could be organized by the people who are successfully coming into ham radio from them. If we could get those people to, let's say, lead the charge. Now, the league and other, let's say, top-down communities can help, disseminate information, but it's really the people on the ground that have to do the work. I think we all have to become evangelists to some degree about what we like and try to find out people with like interests. And everybody's different. Everybody is involved in other groups which are different.
I guess we have to kind of do a marketing study in terms of if we're looking at a demographic. If we're looking at a teenage demographic, for example, or maybe a college-age demographic, then we kind of probably need to see where they're at. It reminds me of there's a young man who just got his ham radio license in one of the offices where I work, who has built and is flying through his college a CubeSat, but the CubeSat is running on one of the, the public data channels, low-power ISM band channels. And I'm thinking, wow, if it had been a whole group of ham radio operators in this college that was building this satellite CubeSat kit, because he's made a kit out of it to build your own CubeSat, then this could be something that perhaps would appeal to that age group and its amateur radio. And, of course, there would be more people that were following it. So maybe we don't have enough information. Maybe we think we already have the answer.
Well, the only thing I'd say that is that, yes, engineering schools, people talking via the ISS, these are all opportunities to display amateur radio. But if you get somebody who's in an engineering school who's a ham, he knows the other guys in the engineering school, and he can probably say, gee, I think Fred would be interested in ham radio. I'm gonna push him a little bit. And, you have your elevator speech, what you refer to as the elevator speech. But then you maybe have the over coffee speech and the come over to my house and see what I'm doing speech. And if people sort of had those things ready to go or had thought about it, they could maybe do some recruiting because, it's hard for the ARRL to wave their magic wand and have new ham radio operators show up. I mean, taking nothing away from everything we're doing now, the VEC program, anything we can get through schools, all of that's fine. But I think we have to do this grassroots idea. It's got to come up from the bottom.
What excites you the most, Dave, about what's happening in amateur radio now?
Well, I think that there are so many things. There are things that I can't even get to do. And here I've been doing this for 65 years, and I'm still not at the end of my wanting to do it. Like, since I had a repeater, we used to have a repeater years ago, but this whole DMR and digital modes and that technology is just, I know virtually nothing about it. And I know to get to learn something about it, I'm probably going to have to put some time into it. And time is a precious commodity. So it's one of the things I want to get to do. I think what's exciting is that we have the opportunity to become more relevant in the world. I mean, emergency communications, the potential of digital communications, propagation modes, understanding some of these things that go on. All of that is exciting to me.
And what advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
I would say find a club. It may not be the first club you find that you like, but find a club that has people of your interest level. Support the national organizations, ARRL. I like CQ magazine too, but and everybody can find something wrong with everything. But without these organs, I don't think the ham radio hobby would be where it is today. And then just talk about ham radio, talk about what you do, and try to create interest.
I actually think that's a great idea, because I love to talk about amateur radio to anybody who'll listen. So, and maybe we need to do more of that with people who aren't hams, just in order to tell them that we're still relevant, we're still here. Dave, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I hope that you did too, and I'll look forward to working with you at some point in the future.
Well, thank you, Eric. I really appreciate the opportunity, and hope to work with you also.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Dave. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in K1KA in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the Expo menu item at the top of the page for updates on the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo coming in September. I'm updating it as I have more information. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart, Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.